Tonight's presentation is by Tom Bancroft, entitled Raptors, Pondering Their Evolution and Adaptations. For anyone who's been a WOS member for any time at all, probably is familiar with Tom to some degree or another. Hopefully you've met him and talked with him or heard him speak. He was fascinated at a very young age with birds. At age 5, he was caught climbing up onto the kitchen sink to watch his mother's bird feeder. That's a great mom. And with that encouragement from family, he went on to acquire his Ph.D. in ornithology from the University of South Florida. Tom worked widely in wildlife conservation and policy locally there in Florida, and then by taking on leadership positions within the Wilderness Society and National Audubon Society. He was chief scientist at Audubon, where he influenced the intersection of science and policy. Shortly after moving to Seattle, which he said was in the recent glaciation period of the Holocene period, he stepped forward to the volunteer for WOS, serving as secretary to the organization for 2 terms, plus shoring up our very important link with members through email and other contributions. Our constant contact email system was something I think he put together. In his other spare time, Tom has written trip reports and pieces for our WOS newsletter. And in April 2020, Tom delivered a great presentation on the Panama cloud forest, which you can watch on our YouTube channel, by the way. Most recently, he has traveled to Madagascar. What a fascinating place. And in November, his first book was published, entitled Beyond the Wonder, An Ecologist's View of Wild Alaska, and that's put out by Washington State University Press. Go Cougs. With that, Tom, I'm going to turn this over to you so that you can really take the show, and this is what everyone came to see.
Okay, great. All right. Well, again, thank you, Elaine, for inviting me, and Dave for the introduction. What I want to do tonight is explore these questions. Who are raptors? How did they evolve? When and maybe where they evolved? So first of all, what is a raptor? Well, the word raptor is derived from Latin and it means to seize, take by force. And, you know, the original definition of raptor that I learned in the 60s and learned in graduate school is what Frank Gill gives in his ornithology textbook, and that raptors are falcons, carcaras, hawks, eagles, old world vultures, kites, ospreys, secretary bird, and new world vultures. But what people kind of said, well, what about owls? And so a lot of people will say, look at owls and say, well, they've got talons. They're kind of ferocious eaters of things. Shouldn't they be raptors? And so some people put them into that category of raptors. And the University of Minnesota has a big raptor program, and they define raptors as birds that have keen eyesight, 8 sharp talons, and a hooked beak. And so they include both the hawks and eagles and that whole group, as well as the owls together as it. Of course, we've got to go look up what Wikipedia says, because Wikipedia, of course, is the fountain of all knowledge. And it says birds of prey, also known as raptors, are hypercarnivorous. I love that term, hypercarnivorous. You know, that to me just really captures it all right there. And they actively hunt and feed on vertebrates, mainly mammals, reptiles, and small birds. What about fish? What about amphibians? What about insects? So they leave a few things out there. But let's go back to the 1960s. This is my first bird book I got as a Christmas present in 1966 when I was a sophomore in high school. My mother gave me this. And we're looking at where these birds were in that field guide helps us kind of understand the thought around evolution at that point. So the falcons, hawks, eagles, and that whole group was under one order, Falconiforms, page 64. And then the owls were under Strigiforms on page 160. So they were kind of farther along in the evolutionary sequence. So if you kind of look at that here, just as kind of a reminder, we were at class aves, mammals is another class, reptiles is a class. Under that order, Falconiforms is where the rough-legged hawk was listed. It's in family Accipitri, the genus Buteo. So that was kind of the classification. Back in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we had them all under Falconiforms. Here's the set of families there. The secretary bird, new world vultures, kites, eagles, all that group, ospreys, falcons, and caracaras. and then the ospreys, the barn owls, and the true owls. So I want to tell you an eBird story here. So I was trained as a bird biologist, worked on bird research for a long time, and then in 1997 I went to work for the Wilderness Society, and we were working on all kinds of other issues. Couldn't really keep up with the bird science. Then I went back to National Audubon for 3 or 4 years and did get back into it, including working with Cornell on setting up eBirds. Then I moved back out here and got kind of away from birds for a few years. But I was still using eBird. My daughter moved to Australia, and in 2015, I went to Australia to see her. And after spending some time with her, I then went birding, and we're out birding, and I saw this falcon. This is a brown falcon, but clearly looking at it, it looks like a falcon. So I pulled out eBird. eBird had recently come out with an app on the phone. So I pulled out eBird and I flipped it open in order to record this falcon. And I scrolled down to where the hawks were, and I go up and down in the hawks. There's no falcons there. I kind of look back at this bird. It's clearly a falcon, but there's no falcons listed in eBird. What's going on? Then I remembered to go up to the top, and there's a place you could enter the search function. I put falcon in, found the brown falcon, and clicked it. And I thought, boy, this is still weird. So I soon scrolled up and down and discovered the falcons were all the way down by parrots. They weren't anywhere near all the other hawks and eagles and that kind of group. They were down by parrots. And that's when I remembered I had seen a note in the newspaper that I hadn't apparently paid attention to very well. And that was at that time, about the mid 2015, scientists finally just said there was overwhelming amount of genetic information that showed that falcons are not closely related to eagles and hawks and kites and vultures. There are a whole separate evolutionary line of evolution there. And it's like, wow, this was a light bulb going off. So I came back here to Seattle, went to University of Washington a whole bunch of times in order to read up on it. There's a really cool database online called Database that gives checklists of birds of the world. There's 4 major checklists that are kind of now accepted. And if you look at them, they each have a slightly different number of species. They may put things in different genera. And what it is there's different sets of scientists that weight things in different ways. And so they have these different checklists. But there's now a group that's trying to come up with a single checklist for the birds of the world. So when we go to another country, we don't have kind of opposing lists of names for the birds we see there. If you belong to Cornell and get eBird stuff, you may get updates from them as they're kind of working through this process of trying to narrow it down to a single checklist. Similar, if you get eBird or you go on to Birds of the World, what you see is every fall, usually October or November, all of a sudden they make a few changes. A couple years ago, they split eastern meadowlark, and all of a sudden I had a new species on my life list, Chinawawan meadowlark, because I had spent a number of years in southern Arizona, and at the time I was there, they hadn't realized that the meadowlark down there really had a different song, different breeding strategy. So you see some of those kind of changes. We've just had a whole bunch of changes in the hawk group just in this last month or so. So I will talk about some of those kinds of things as we go forward. So where are we now at the order level? So we have 2 groups. There's 2 different evolutionary lines here. Circled in red is the group that includes the New World vultures, the hawks and eagles and secretary bird from Africa, and then the owls. So that's in one group. Then there's a whole bunch of orders kind of listed in between those, the mouse birds, the cuckoo rollers, kingfishers, barbets, that whole group, before you get to this other line. And that's the Siriemus, and I'll show you a picture of one of those from South America. The falcons, and then the parrots. And the falcons, the sister group to the falcons, the parrots. The most closely related birds to falcons are parrots. I just find that really fascinating. But when you look at them, there's a lot of similarities too. And then the next closest sister group is the passerines, the perching birds there. So really kind of some fascinating differences. So what do we want to explore tonight? We want to explore, where did these raptors evolve? What factors led to them, kind of the geography, climate, and opportunities there. Now, kind of my understanding as I put this talk together and kind of through my kind of time in science was, 3 times this combination of talons, hook beaks, and keen eyesight developed from something that didn't have it. Now, I'm actually going to throw a wrench into that at the end of this with some new stuff that I've just found there. But that was kind of my understanding is, these were separate evolutionary lines, separate things of developing this predatory nature there. And then I also want to come back and say, did birds try to get this in some other places and kind of play with that? So what we've got to do is we've got to step back and look at continental drift. There's a really fantastic video available on YouTube. If you Google 240 million years ago to 250 million years in the future, you can find that video, and it shows the continents moving. And I'm going to show you a piece of that video a little bit later on. But this is important in thinking about the evolutionary of birds. So here's 100 million years ago. This is the location of the continents at that point. Now there's things to notice here. Notice South America is not connected to North America, but it is connected to Antarctica, and Australia is connected to Antarctica. Antarctica is not frozen. It's not frozen. Africa is now separating from South America there. Look at there. India is about ready to take off there. 100 million years ago, we had birds. Yeah, there are dinosaurs everywhere, and birds are a branch of dinosaurs. There were birds everywhere at that point there. And this is kind of the layout then, with birds spread all around the world with the dinosaurs. So Archaeopteryx is often considered the first bird, and sometimes you see people talk about, well, is that a true bird or is it a bird like dinosaur? Is it a true bird or bird like dinosaur? And what's happened here is there's a series of characteristics that have developed through evolution, and there's what we call bird-like dinosaurs have some of the characteristics that birds have. Birds have some of the characteristics that bird-like dinosaurs have. And it gets to be very semantic. Oftentimes they're mixed in various ways, but you ended up with a line that became the birds that came out of that theropod dinosaur group. Kim Adelson made 3 presentations to WOS over the last couple years, talking about dinosaurs and bird development during the Mesozoic. I would recommend you, if you want to learn more about it, sure go into a lot more detail than what I'm going in tonight. So that's a great place. So we've got birds at 100 million years ago. Archaeopteryx is older than that, 150 million years. We also had bird-like dinosaurs. Many of them had feathers. This is a velociraptor. All the evidence now says they would cover with feathers. Jurassic Park had it all wrong in the early 90s. They should have had feathers on those velociraptors as they were running around eating the people. So if you look at our birds, now the secondary feathers come off the ulna, on the lower part of our arm here. That's where the secondary feathers come off. And there's little nodules where the feathers attach to the bone. On a velociraptor, they have those same nodules there, which is evidence that there were feathers coming off of there. I found this really nice field guide a couple years ago, Field Guide to Mesozoic Birds, and the evidence points to that during that time of dinosaurs, there may well have been as many birds with all kinds of different orders out there on the landscape as what we have now. Some of them had teeth, some of them had bony tails, they had feathers, some of them had bills like our guys have now. A lot of diversity. I've now got this field guide, so if one of you could just get your time machine working, we can zip back there and add some Mesozoic birds to our life list. But, the take-home message is birds were around. There were lots of them. And then we come to 66 million years ago. And again, just remind you what the continents look like at that time. South America is still connected to Antarctica. Antarctica is warm, connected to Australia. Supposing you're down here where eventually Buenos Aires is going to be and you want a cup of coffee, you could conceivably walk down here, walk across the Antarctica, and go over here to Melbourne, Australia, get your cup of coffee, you just want to watch out that you don't get eaten by a Tyrannosaurus Rex or a Velociraptor on the way. India is headed up toward there to make the Himalayas there, but we've got those connections. This is very isolated. South America is not connected to North America at the time, and Africa is kind of separated. And then at 66 million years ago, what happened? We had this giant meteor come in, crash into the Earth, send a fireball all the way around the world. All of the forests of the world burned. Over 75% of land animals and plants all got killed by that. And it crashed in at that point. So again, here's those continents. The meteor crashed in up here near the Yucatan, sent a fireball around the world, and that killed about 75% of it, killed all the dinosaurs. What seemed to survive was small animals that were ground-based rather than up in trees, and that could feed on seeds. So in the case of birds, had a hard bill without teeth in it, had a hard bill that presumably could feed on seeds or roots or aquatic kinds of food items there. And that's what seemed to survive there. So note, Antarctica still green. Where did they survive? The thought is in the southern continents. Farthest away from that fireball would have been Antarctica and Australia. We don't know a lot about what survived in Antarctica because it's all covered with ice and we can't go find those fossils very well now. But it's clearly Australia was important in the survival of it. This book, The Largest Avian Radiation, is one that I've used a lot in putting this talk together. It's an incredible tome, very thick and full of information. I ordered it before it came out, and it came in November, and the first thing I had to do was go get new glasses. Then I had to get a new light over my couch in order to read it because of the fine print. But it's just stuff full of information. And what this kind of does in this figure is, okay, 100 million years ago, we had the ancestor of birds. What looks like happened is three different branches of real birds made it through that meteor strike. And we're going to look at those three branches of birds here. So the three branches were the paleognaths, which are the ratites, that's the ostriches, emus, and cassowaries, also the tinamous and kiwis. Now, the genetic evidence suggests is what made it through was a very small bird that was a good flyer. And all these gigantic birds came from bird that made it to those continents after the meteor struck. And then they had the genetic potential to grow big in order to avoid predation, presumably. And so they grew big. That concept of genetic potential we'll come back to a couple times, and I'll try to develop it a little more. So that was one group of birds that came through. Second group was the galioforms. This, whoops, the gallionaires, which are the waterfowl and the landfowl, the chickens, the geese, the turkeys, that kind of group. They made it through, and then what became everything else, the neo-aves. And those neo-aves then divided very quickly into 4 or 5 different groups. We're going to follow one of those, the tellur aves, which is the land bird radiation here. So let's kind of take that apart a little bit more here. So we've got the ancestor of birds up here. It divided into these 3 branches that made it through that catastrophe at the end of the Cretaceous that killed all the dinosaurs. And so we've got something that became all of the ratites. Now there's some controversy in this group. There's some genetic evidence that suggests that maybe the ducks and the fowl, the chickens and grouse in that group, had actually divided, separated, evolved separately before the meteor hit, in which case we would then have 4 groups that actually made it through. Then we had the groups that made it over here, which quickly radiated into lots of different groups. And what we're thinking about mainly tonight is these 2 here. So we'll look at them here. So the teleavies, the land bird radiation, divided into two major groups, the Afro-aves, you got it, Africa is going to be a connection. The Austro-aves, connection to Australia and South America there as the other big group here that came about. So we need to kind of think about time a little bit more here. So here's the timelines up through the Cenozoic. So the Paleocene, that first 10 million years after the meteor hit, was rapid diversification of plants and of animals. Probably all the orders of birds that we have now, there's 40 or so of them, evolved during that time period there. And then we had lots of speciation happening during the Eocene. Then as we get into the Oligocene, what we're going to see, and you'll see that in a few minutes, there was a major glaciation starting to happen that eventually came from both poles. That would have divided things up, isolated stuff in different places, which then they're facing different selection pressures. We would get more evolution going on there. And so we'll want to kind of, again, pay attention to this falcon, parrot, and perching bird group, and the hawks and owls and woodpecker group as we move forward here. All right, I'm going to show you an animation of continental drift. This is starting 80 million years ago. And so at 80 million years ago, we still had dinosaurs, we had birds, and that meteor's going to hit it about 66 million years ago, wipe out most everything, isolating stuff. Then we're going to have birds develop over it, and we're going to run all the way down to 20 million years. And I'm going to play this animation twice because it shows you lots of information. What I want you to pay attention to is right now there's a connection between South America and Antarctica and a connection between Australia and Antarctica. Antarctica is warm. It's not covered with ice. It's warm. Africa and South America is not connected to North America. That isthmus starts to form about 15 million years ago. Actual land bridge is only 2.5 or so million years. Africa's off here by itself. Watch India, it's going to head north, but Australia will stay out here by itself during this. Let's watch this animation. So there goes India up north. India just hit. Now we've got radiation of those bird groups happening. Now watch what happens in about 40 million years. Oh, Antarctica's frozen. Now at about 30 million years, we're getting freezing in the Arctic now. We get a major glaciation in the Arctic coming down. So what happened at 40 million years, we've got the separation from South America and Antarctica, the separation from Australia and Antarctica, formed the Southern Ocean, the roaring 60s. We had water being able to swirl all the way around. If you've ever gone to Antarctica and gone across the Drake's Passage, you know what that is all about. Apparently the waves there and the wind can be incredibly movement. That separation allowed Antarctica to freeze up. And then as we had the separation up here between North America and Europe, we got the glaciation happening up there. Both of those would cause lots of isolation of groups into different places, allowing more evolution to take place because of different selection. Let's watch this one more time. Meteor's about ready to hit. Just hit. Everything's dead. Now stuff's got to start re-evolving here. Good period of evolution right now. Now we're going to get the freezing of Antarctica. Anything that's in South America can't now walk over to Australia, or vice versa. All right, so 40 million years, I've kind of talked about that. That forming of the Southern Ocean was a major climatic change that let Antarctica freeze up there. 30 million years ago, we're still getting that kind of frozen there. We're starting to get freezing up above, but we've got real isolation here. And just to think about it from perching birds' perspective, before this freezing up here, we had the evolution of perching birds, and presumably they could spread all the way around here, through Antarctica and up into South America. The first group of perching birds was the suboceans. A subocean we get up here is all the flycatchers, but you go down to South America, Central America, there's a whole bunch of them. There's the ant pittas and the a whole bunch of those kind of groups, the cotingas and a number of other ones, the ovenbirds and so forth. Then over here in Australia, presumably they were there too. There's some in Africa there, but then songbirds evolved and they took over. But they were isolated there. They had a big opportunity to evolve in lots of ways. Songbirds then spread around the world from Australia and became the dominant. They're half of all birds in the world are in that songbird category here. So they came from there. So you got that songbird evolution, but the early perching birds were isolated in South America, and it was a long, long time before any songbirds got there. And so we had this radiation. There's more than 1,000 species of suboceans in South and Central America. The only big group that gets up into North America are the flycatchers, and we've got lots of them up here. All right, so let's get back to our raptors. So I'm going to take this apart over the next couple slides. So I know it's really busy here, but we've got the Afro group up here, which includes our New World vultures, the owls, and all the hawks. And then with the Austral group, which includes the Seriamus and the falcons, and then the parrot group there. And we want to look at these in a little more detail. So in the Afro group, what evidently happened is we've got a branching that took place here. Somehow the New World vultures got to the New World, where we seem to have had a major radiation referring to the speciation that takes place that happens with the hawks and eagles. They're probably originating out of Africa and then spreading around the world. And then we've got another branch that resulted in the various owls, and then all these others, the puff birds, woodpeckers, and that whole group there. So in the Austroaves group, we've got that kind of group there. We've got these falcons, this kind of the basal group here. And I'll come back to this. This group of falcons is the forest falcons. They're found only in Latin America. And then the caracaras also only in Latin America. Caracaras get up here into North America too. And then the falcons, which are all over the world. And then here's the parrot group, the basal parrot. And basal in taxonomy refers to kind of the first evolution within that group. So the kind of farthest back, the one that was first coming about is known as the basal group. The basal parrots are all found in Australia and also in New Zealand. And then we've got, of course, New Zealand wrens only in New Zealand. I don't know what their distribution was. We don't have fossil records for it. But the suboceans, which have some in the old world, but their major radiation is South America. And then we've got the songbirds, and the basal songbirds are found only in Australia. If you don't know this book, Where Song Began by Tim Lowe, it's again a really fun book to read because he's an Australian and he's trying to show that all of us from the far north who think that the center of the world is in the northern hemisphere got it all wrong. That in terms of birds, Australia is really critical for the evolution of birds. And he does a really nice job there. So to tie this all together, I want to change directions a little bit. I want to get into behaviors and try to think about behaviors and see how this isolation might have fed to our development of these various raptors. And so we're going to look at that. If you've ever gone birding with me or taken a bird course from me, you know I harp a lot on for identification. It's about size and shape. It's about color patterns. It's about behavior. It's about distribution and habitat and calls. Those are the things we use to separate them out. In terms of the raptors, shape and behavior are the most important, but distribution and habitat comes in there really critically. And I think you're going to see some fun stuff about distribution as we go through these next set of slides. A couple of review concepts just to keep in the back of the mind. I'll talk about convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is when similar features develop because of selection. They develop in order to have a certain behavior or a certain lifestyle, and they come from an ancestors that had different setups. So they kind of coming in that converging versus diverging is when you go separate apart, and that can be simple things like, the separation of eastern metallarks from western metallarks. That is divergent evolution, but it can also be on a bigger scale. And then this idea of genetic potential, and we'll come back to this. Is there the genetic potential for something to evolve in a certain way there? Some things have that genetic potential, some things don't. And so we want to kind of look at that. And one of the things that irks the heck out of me when I'm reading like the newspaper is you see them talk about primitive, and they'll say about an animal, this animal is primitive, it hasn't changed in 100 million years, or whatever the number is here. And we'll look at platypus. This is platypus, which is a mammal. It lays eggs. Laying eggs for a mammal is a primitive trait, unquestionably. More advanced traits are what the marsupials have, and then the next advancement was the placentals, like what we have. And so laying eggs is definitely a primitive trait. But a platypus is not a primitive animal. It's a highly adaptive animal for Eastern Australia. It has incredible abilities of finding food. It's got a highly developed sensory system that uses all kinds of measuring of electricity in the water column there. It's highly adapted there. So to say it's primitive in that sense of it hasn't changed is incorrect. Let's take another example. We're part of the group known as tetrapods. Tetrapods just means four limbs. We're part of the tetrapod group. All reptiles, mammals, and birds are all that tetrapod group. The primitive trait of tetrapods is to have 5 digits on your front and hind limbs. On your front limbs, we've got humerus, ulna, and ulna and radius, and then all the carpals and metacarpals of our front end. That's a primitive trait. Nobody would call us primitive, humans primitive. I'm not going to imply that. But in terms of our limb structure is primitive. A more evolved limb structure is what you have in horses or cows, where they've had a lot of fusing of the bones there, a lot of bones lost. So a horse walks on a single finger. It's walking on its middle finger. It's lost most of those other bones, or they're reduced in size, and it's had a lot of the bones of the wrist are fused to form the shin bone on the front of the horse, and the knee on the front of the horse is actually their wrist. Same thing with a cow, they're down to just 2 toes. So they're advanced. So this concept of primitive, we want to be careful about how we use it when we're thinking about the evolution of animals. And yeah, I'm probably just being overly picky here. So as we go forward here, we want to ponder the evolution there. We're going to try to link continental drift, changing climates and behavior development, and look at some of these going on. In some cases, I'm going to tell you what I've read in the scientific literature. In some cases, I can't find anything about it in the scientific literature. So I'm going to tell you it's my hypothesis based upon kind of my knowledge. What I want to emphasize in all of this is what I'm presenting tonight is a rapidly changing field of knowledge. When I came back from Australia in 2015 and read about all these groups at that time, they thought most of the orders of birds might have actually made it through that catastrophe at the end of the Cretaceous. But that was because of the way they were kind of trying to combine genetic information with fossil information. And later they decided those assumptions weren't correct, and they changed the assumptions. And now we kind of think what I present. And same thing, there's been a lot of switching around of relationships among genera and some family changes around there. It's a field that's changing. A lot for us still to learn around raptors. 5 years, you're probably going to see something. So Bancroft had it wrong. I hope I'm still alive. Call me up. Let's go out and have a beer and we can talk about it, because I think that's what science is all about, is asking questions, learning more, saying, well, what about this, and throwing that back out there. Let's look at falcons. I've never seen anything written about where did this order of birds evolve. My guess is South America. That's my guess is. And here's why. If you look at South America, you've got sirens. That's the only place they're found in South America. If you look at the falcons, there's three subfamilies in the falcons. The forest falcons are found in South America. Now with the land bridge, I've seen the forest falcon in Panama, but they get up into southern Mexico. And then the caracaras, South America, we get a crested caracara up here in the United States, so they've kind of moved up there. And if you look at the genetics, the forest falcons split off about 30 million years ago. Well, 30 million years ago, South America was isolated from Australia. We've got the parrots developing over in Australia and the falcons developing over here. So that's kind of what I think happened there. And I think it's a good hypothesis. Got to be tested. If you look at these continents there and this group, so we were just talking about here, so 60 million years ago, you could still get around through there. 50 million years ago, you could still get around, but we're getting more isolation. Then we've got the freezing up there. And if you look at the parrot group, again, the basal group of the parrots are found over here in Australia and New Zealand. Yeah, parrots are in South America, and there are lots of them. Well, again, a thing that's changed used to be the parrots in South America were in a separate family from the parrots in Africa. Now it's the African and South American parrots are all in a single family. And what I'm guessing, again, we need to double check that. I think this is talked about in the literature, is the thought is probably an ancestor made it across here before this got as wide as it is now. All right, Accipity and strigiforms, we'll consider them a little separately here. So what happened with the strigiform groups? So I'm in the accipitriforms. I never was good in Latin. Africa clearly is important. That's where secretary bird is. That's the really basal group of this whole. But how did we get the New World vultures here? 60 million years ago, there wasn't a lot of distance between Africa. Maybe we had an early one that got blown across here to Africa and then filled that kind of niche in and grew into the 7 species we have now. And there may well have been additional ones in the past there. That's kind of the possibility. You remember I said that University of Minnesota said, New World vultures aren't raptors. Well, I wanted to get a good picture of a New World vulture so I could just look at their feet. And I finally got one last year. Here's, of course, a turkey vulture there. Their feet aren't, they're still talon-based feet, but they're not the strong talons of a hawk or a falcon or an owl. So they've definitely, and they don't need them because they're not trying to carry prey. They're not trying to kill prey. They're feeding on dead animals there. So that is the explanation on why the University of Minnesota took them out and why some other people have taken them out. But then other people, including me, think you ought to have them in there. What about the owls? So the barn owl group is the basal group of owls. There are 18 species in that 2 genera. Tyto is the main one that our barn owl in. This is a sooty owl. Sooty owls occur in Australia. I've heard a sooty owl call, but I've yet to see one. This is the other genus. It's found in the East Indies and also near India. But if you look at the number of species, you find out there's a big concentration of this family of species in Southeast Asia and in Australia, a number of Tytos in Australia. Again, my hypothesis is the ancestor of owls somehow got over into that part of the world, and then they evolved in order to fill in this night feeding strategy. And when they came back together with the hawks owl groups, they really became nocturnal animals. And the Tytos, this family is much more nocturnal than the rest of the owls. The rest of the owls, as you know, have a lot of species that are adapted to feeding in the daytime too. But I don't know. I find that a possibility there, and I just really fascinating. I was in Madagascar in October, and we got to see a red owl. This obviously looks like a barn owl, and it's just a different species of barn owl that's found only in Madagascar. Let's look at these two groups, the Afro-Aves group on the left and the Austro-Aves group on the right. You want to evolve I shouldn't say it that way. A bird evolves to really specialize in feeding in the grassland savanna habitats, going after snakes. A good way to do that is to have long legs, have a long neck, do a lot of walking, and then grab those snakes. We got a species in Africa. It's the secretary bird. I got to see them hunt there, and they just walk through the grass looking for snakes. I've not seen a Syriema very well. I saw one at a gazillion miles away in South America one time. But you look at those two birds and you go, whoa, they really do look alike. Aren't they related? No, they are not related. They're out of these two different branches of bird evolution. This is an excellent case of convergent evolution in order to feed on snakes. Fish eating. A lot of birds feed on fish. Of course, we've got ospreys, very specialized on fish. In South America, we've got this black-shouldered kite, a black-shouldered hawk, also very specialized on fish. They even have little serrations on their talons, like the osprey has, for holding those fish. Bald eagles feed a lot on fish. This bird below it is a white-bellied sea eagle from Australia. 2 years ago, it was in the same genus. They've now separated it out this fall into a separate genus. I'll cover that in a minute, but you can see the similar shape, very similar behaviors in terms of what they eat and how they go about feeding. There are fish-eating owls also. I don't know if there's a fish-eating owl in Latin America. If you know of one, please let me know because I would love to find that out. I've spent some time trying to read about different owls, but I haven't found one there. But there are some fish-eating owls. The Blankenstone fish-eating owl. If you're not familiar with this book, Owls of the Eastern Ice, I'd highly recommend it. It's about a graduate student studying this endangered species in Russia, trying to deal with how do you get out in this incredibly freezing weather in order to catch these birds and study them, and also work with his colleagues there who had been drinking vodka since they were 2 years old. And it's a custom that if somebody brings a bottle of vodka, you have to finish the bottle off before you can go to bed. So it has some interesting stories. Frogs, crayfish. I spent a lot of time in Florida working on some bird issues and in the savanna areas in Central Florida. The red-shouldered hawks there are really specialized on frogs, crayfish, and snakes, and the barred owls are specialized on the same thing. Good division of day versus night. Bird feeding, small birds. Let's think about that now. Okay, a feeding opportunity develops. The evolution of songbirds really took off 20 million years ago, and then just has really been mushrooming ever since there, with lots of species developing there. So somebody's going to take an opportunity in order to feed on that. And we've had that example, that opportunity come out of all three of these groups. Falcons, this is a merlin, specialized in feeding birds. It's like a fighter pilot, flies down the birds and grabs them. We've got a Cooper's hawk down here, the accipiters, different strategy to catch them. They've got short rounded wings, a long tail. They bolt out to grab something and be able to twist and turn through the trees in order to grab it. We've got the northern pygmy owl also sits up there, looks for those chickadees and juncos and nuthatches and stuff, and then chases them down. So good example of specialized bird feeders in each of these three groups. Morphologically, they look a little different, but behaviorally, they're keyed into how to catch those little birds. Mammals, we got the same kind of thing. Buteo, rough-legged hawk, big mammal eater. Golden eagles, big mammal eater. Great horned owls, big mammal eaters. And then also these guys, the northern harriers really specialize on mammals and small birds in marsh and grassland areas. Oh, I lost my place there. Now, gyrfalcons, I tried to refine this. I watched the PBS special a few years ago on gyrfalcons and I couldn't refine it. But one of the things was really fascinating on there. They were hunting snowshoe hares. and they were hunting snowshoe hares just like what you may have seen a peregrine falcon chasing down a dunlin or a merlin chasing down a house sparrow. Just this pursuit flying with the snowshoe hare running left and running right, trying to get away. And when I watch that, I go, yeah, that's the falcon hunting system there. They've got the long pointed wings for really fast flying there. So really spectacular there. Snails, we've got specialized snail eaters here in the Western Hemisphere, snail kites and hook-billed kites, and I could never understand why there wasn't a specialized snail eater in the raptor group in Africa. I kept looking at all the different raptors to try to figure that out. And when I was there a couple years ago, I finally found out why. There's a stork, the open bill, that's highly specialized in feeding on snails. So probably that niche was filled up before a raptor started to feed on there, and there are lots of snails over there. So I talked about genetic potential and the ability for something to adapt. And this is a good example that I'm going to play for you here. I worked on Everglades issues for a long time. Snail kites were in the Everglades, an endangered species, a lot of concern around them. And in the early 2000s, African snail got into the Everglades, outcompeted the local snail, the apple snail that these snail kites fed on, created a major conservation problem. But there was some genetic variability in that population, and you'll hear that here in this video.
In the early 2000s, an invasive snail species took over these wetlands. The new snails were 5 times bigger than their usual prey. Most snail kites couldn't eat them. Many birds vanished, along with any hope for their survival in Florida. But 10 years later, the snail kites were back. Their population tripling to over 2,000 birds. And they were catching and eating the bigger snails. But with some major changes. Their beaks and bodies had grown up to 12% bigger in little more than a decade. It turns out a few big-beaked birds could handle the new supersized prey. And birds with bigger beaks pass those genes on to their young. Happening in less than 2 snail kite generations. The speed of change is almost unbelievable.
A good example of kind of genetic adaptation there. There were bigger individuals, and those were the ones that were successful. Carrying eating, again, we got convergent evolution, New World vultures, Old World vultures, and actually among that accipitriform group, the vulture kind of carrion eating has evolved more than once there. So that's kind of interesting. In the falcon group, we've got the caracaras. In the actual hawks and eagles, many of those feed a lot on carrion. Bald eagle is a big carrion eater. The wedge-tailed eagle, which is a gigantic eagle in Australia, big carrion eater. And black kites are a big carrion eater. They're talked about a lot in Europe, in literature in Europe, like in Shakespeare and stuff. Caracaras, again, in that falcon group. Yeah, they're omnivorous, but carrion's an important part of the diet for most species. And there's even one species here that specializes in eating wasps, bees, ants, termites, and lizards and fruits. So really some fascination there. And guess what? There's a vulture that specializes in fruit. So adult palm nut vultures, about 2/3 of their diet is fruit. And for juvenile palm nuts, about 90%. So we got a fruit-eating raptor. How do you take that? All right, we want to look at a couple genera here just to see these examples of diversification. Haliaetus is what bald eagles are. 2 years ago, there were 10 species in that. They've divided this bottom 6 into a separate genus now, just this fall in October and November. So if you go to Birds of the World that David was talking about, you'll see that change now in Birds of the World. And my understanding of the reason is they've been looking at the genetics, and the genetics suggest that some of what we're seeing morphologically there that made them think these were all from a same evolutionary line might actually be cases of convergence. So that kind of network of lines is a little more complex, so they've separated these out. They're clearly closely related, but not enough to be in the same genus, and we may be seeing converging take a place. So we've got the bald eagle, which is our species there. 2 years ago, I would have asked you what are the genus of these two, and you would have probably said, boy, they sure look like bald eagles. They happen to be separated out into a different genus now. Same kind of thing with accipiters. 2 years ago, 45 species in this. These are the bird eating specialists among the hawk group there. And our three here in North America, sharp-shinned Coopers and northern goshawks. Well, they've separated out Coopers and northern goshawks from the accipiter and put them into this genus called Aster. And I just want to again do this kind of thought process, thought exercise with you. Look at the distribution of these two species. Cooper's hawks is kind of southern North America. The American goshawk is kind of northern North America. Sure, they do overlap, but like here in Washington, I think of the Coopers as more a lowland species and the goshawk more an upland contiguous forest kinds of species there. And now we've got a Eurasian goshawk. It used to be one goshawk northern. Now they've separated those into two species. So how might have this evolved? I'll use an example from another group of birds in which the science is really quite good around that to give this thought process to you. And that's to look at the black-throated green warbler complex. That complex has 4 species. The black-throated green is the one that breeds up in the boreal forest. Out here, we've got Townsend's black-throated gray and hermit warblers. If you look at the boreal forest, this is a distribution of it now. The idea has to do with where was the ancestor of this complex up in those boreal forests. And then we had this series of glaciations. So we had at least 4, maybe 7 major glaciations that came down out of Canada, divided up the country, isolated populations in various ways, create refugia where species had to survive in, maybe facing different evolutionary pressures that involved there. And so we've got this kind of glaciation coming down, creating a refugia in the east, in the Rocky Mountains, and in the Northwest. And so if you look at this complex, so the idea is the ancestor of the black-throated green, not the black-throated green, the ancestor of it got divided by that first glaciation. And in the east, it continued to develop into this ancestor, that line that would become the black-throated green. In the west, perhaps we got the black-throated gray, or what would become the black-throated gray. Then we've got everything going back north. That black-throated green ancestor spreads back out there. We've got another glaciation coming down. We've got another separation and another evolving of 2 lines there. Maybe the line that ended up with this Townsend hermit. Then we have a third, maybe it divided the ancestor of the Townsend hermit somehow, and we've got those two species there. So we've got that glaciation playing a role in the isolation, creating the geographic isolation that allowed selection to operate in a different ways. Might that happen in this genus Aster? I don't know. It's interesting looking at the genus. So here's Cooper's hawk. This hawk is found in Cuba. Then we've got the two goshawks. These three are in the old world. These two are Latin America. So yeah, maybe glaciation played some role in that, in their evolution. When I went to Australia in 2015, I saw this bird, and my first look at it was, there's a Cooper's hawk, although I knew there were no Cooper's hawks in Australia. So it was a brown goshawk. In that time, it was in that genus Accipiter. They've now moved it out into a separate genus for those same kind of reasons that I talked about with the bald eagle group. This time I was in Madagascar, and we are in this forest area, and this little tiny sparrowhawk flew up and landed there. And my first look at it was, boy, that is a really small sharp-shinned hawk. Well, it's not a sharp-shinned hawk. It's a Madagascar sharp sparrowhawk, just very small. But you look at that body shape, you look at that size. We watched this thing hunt there for maybe half an hour. It flew to 3 or 4 perches there, just like what they do, Coopers and Sharpshin, flew the perch and then searched for a bird that it might be able to attack there. We've got our buteos, a bunch of buteo species. And again, you see that same body shape, that same feeding behavior all over the world there. When we were in Madagascar, we looked across this big open area there. There was a hawk sitting on the tree way far away, too far to get very good look through the binoculars. My immediately reaction was, boy, that sure looks like a red-tailed hawk over there. Well, it wasn't. It was a Madagascar buzzard, which is the version of the buteo that they have in Madagascar. Here's our buteos here in Washington. Ospreys, I just find their distribution really fascinating around the world. You can see they breed a lot up here in the northern hemisphere, then fly down to the southern hemisphere for the winter. But then there's these pockets where they're all year round in Florida, in Baja California, along the northern coast of Australia, all through the East Indies area here, up in Japan, and a little bit in China there. What's going on? And so I wonder where this species evolved and then spread around the world. Maybe it evolved there, in the Australia, Indonesia area, and then got that good at eating fish and was able to spread all the way around the world. Intriguing idea. Lots of stuff written on the evolution of this bird, but I've not seen that talked about particularly there. Another concept is this idea of superspecies, which refers to a group of species that are clearly very closely related, but are different species primarily because of geography here. We've got that example here. We've got the white-tailed kite in the Western Hemisphere, the black-shouldered in Africa, and the black-shouldered in Australia, and the black-winged in Africa. Then the letterwing, I'm not seeing the letterwing. I've seen these other 3 here. That is kind of the interior part of Australia here. Here's our white-tailed kites from North America. If I showed you this picture without any information on where the picture was taken, your initial reaction was, oh, that's a white-tailed kite. And then I tell you where it is, then you know it's a black-winged kite because it was from Africa here. I really love this genus. This is the genus that northern harriers are in. They're found all over the world. And oh my word, do they look the same. They've got those long tails. They've got those long rounded wings. They fly low over wetlands or prairie kinds of habitat, clearly hunting in the same way. It's a model of a bird that's worked really well and diversified around the world there. Northern harriers. Falcons, highly successful group there. Here's our falcons. I flew into Amboseli National Park, and we got off out of this small airplane on this dirt runway, and I got down, looked across. Here are these 2 birds sitting in an acacia tree. My initial reaction, they gotta be falcons. I had no idea what kind they were, but they had to be falcons. You could tell by the shape there. These are greater kestrels. Same thing, bubo, what our great horned owls is, and snowy owl here. This photograph is great horned owl in Africa, which is the Feryx eagle owl there. Strix, another highly successful genus there. These are our 3 species there. If I showed you this bird, what would you say it was? You might say, oh, that looks sort of like a golden eagle. You're right, it's in that genus, but this one is the tawny eagle in Africa. All right, I want to put a wrench into some of the things that I've talked about here. This article came out in 2019, only I just found it in this last week. And I'm not seeing the idea of this whole set of authors talked about very much. But what their idea was, if you look at the basal group in these 2 big radiations, so in the Austroaves and the Afroaves, the basal groups all have these raptorial characteristics of hooked beaks, good eyesight, and talons. And their idea is this whole group of birds, that's what the original one that evolved had that characteristic. And then those characteristics were lost at least twice, lost in the evolution of all of these other guys down here that are in the Afroaves group. And there's a dozen or more orders down there, and also up here with the parrots and the passerines. Good possibility, because I mean our New World vultures are losing some of those characteristics of the talons, and the Old World vultures have lost some of the talons kind of idea. So that's an idea. It's intriguing to think about, and it'll be fun to see how it's taken up in the literature over it. I want to play a little bit with this idea of genetic potential. You look at shrikes, a lot of people say, hey, shrikes should be a raptor. They're a major predator, and they are. You look at, they've got a hooked bill, they've got keen eyesight, they can carry prey in their feet, and they will carry a small mouse or a small a bird in there. They do tend to stick them on thorns or on a barbed wire fence to hold stuff, but they can carry them. But they don't really have talents. They don't really have talents. Well, I decided to take this poor northern shrike into Photoshop. Photoshop has this artificial intelligence change function that you can do. And so I selected its feet and I asked it to change it and give it eagle talons. So here's a northern shrike with eagle talons. They don't have the genetic potential to develop them. But watch out if you're a chickadee and they suddenly get that, because then there could be some ferocious predator there. So where have we gone today? Well, what I've hoping I've given you is just lots of information on these 3 incredible lines of bird evolution, how they've adapted, where and what they might come about. And I hope you have a wonderful birding trip this fall, this winter, where you get to see representatives from all 3 of these lines. Maybe next spring you get to add in that New World vulture line there, and maybe you'll be out birding and you'll say to your friend beside you, thank you, South America. And they'll look at you and go, what? Well, I just saw Merlin fly by. Or, you're say, thank you, Africa or Australia, for what they've given us in terms of birds and what they've come about. I need to do a first plug in here from our sponsors, and that's me. I'm excited to say I have a new book that's just been published by Washington State University Press. It's based upon a week I spent up in Alaska, and it does a lot of what I've done in this presentation tonight. It's about sharing my love of wild country and love of wild animals and their conservation. So it looks at the science of brown bears, salmon, and birds up there, their evolution, some of their conservation challenges, but it also looks at the values. I mean, we all love birds because they mean something to us, and we all get joy from watching them. We all get solace from being out in nature, and it's about developing all of that kinds of stuff. The book is just being released this week. It should be available in stores. They do have it at Third Place Books here in Seattle right now, and it is available directly from Washington State University Press in the paperback version, but it should be in bookstores by the end of the week. The hardback version will come out later in December. I'll be giving a talk at the Mountaineers on this book on Wednesday. You're welcome to come. You can just show up in person at the program center on Sandpoint. If you want to get the Zoom link and listen to the presentation there, just send me an email to that. I think with that, it's time to open it up for questions. So I'll turn it back over to you, Elaine. Thank you all very much.
Oh, OMG. Thomas, there has not been a single question. You've had everyone purely wrapped in what you were talking about. I had the great pleasure of pasting in about 15 links that you provided, which was really nice.
Oh, okay, great.
Now that people are coming up for air, maybe someone has a question they'd like to simply unmute, maybe turn on your camera. We'd love to hear and see any questions that anyone can put their mouths
Let's
around.
see.
Well, Tom, I had such a great time following some of those links, many of them. One of the ones I was really interested in, because I actually spent some time in Florida as well, the Everglades kite. And you, as I don't know which post you were in, but you had something to do with writing some position papers and maybe getting legislative work on the river grass.
I
Marjorie
did.
Stoneman Douglas would be proud of you.
Yeah, yeah. No, I spent 10 years working on Everglades issues for National Audubon, and then 3 years working for Archbold Biological Station. And it was funny for National Audubon. I argued heavily that we didn't get involved with water quality issues because it was such a quagmire. And then I was appointed to represent the entire environmental community on the technical panel that developed the restoration plan for the Everglades. So I ended up playing a big role in it, including helping write some legislation that went through the state system there. So it was very rewarding 10, 13 years that I did down there. Really fascinating stuff.
Well, we can only thank you. There might be one person out there who does not know that phrase "river of grass," but
Right.
Florida, you can describe it better than I am sure. But Florida is actually slightly bowl-shaped.
Yeah. Well, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas wrote a fantastic book that she titled River of Grass, and it's all about the Everglades. And the original River of Grass, Okeechobee is like partway up and it's the big lake partway up the peninsula there. And Okeechobee would overflow the bottom, and it would just flow all the way down and out into Florida Bay at the very southern part of the peninsula, 100 miles or so down there, 20, 30 miles wide, and that was the River of Grass. Half of that is now gone. The northern third of it is the agricultural area where they grow sugar. And then the eastern quarter of it is Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and that whole band up through West Palm Beach, where they've expanded right out to the edge. And so the challenge in conservation is, can you have this thing that's only half the size of the original one still function in a natural way? And that was what the whole part was. What is that natural way, and how do you get that to happen? And I was lucky enough to be part of that for 10 years, and it's an ongoing conservation challenge. So really fantastic issue.
That's great. I again, it was so wonderful that you mined all these wonderful references. And for anyone who wasn't bombarded by me putting things in the chat, I'm sorry if that was a bother, but there's about 15 things, and you can scroll up on your chat. I just pasted the plate tectonics reference, which is that YouTube that you
showed. That one's really fun. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, and it's and I think one of the challenges why that whoever put that together, just magnificent. You read these descriptions of stuff, and like for me, I read them, but it's like, how do you really understand them? And to see it visually can make stuff so much more clearly. So seeing that visually was really neat.
Again, folks, just go up and click on those little blue links, and you'll have a place to do some midnight reading or tomorrow's reading.
So Tom, this is Dave, and one of your first slides had this book. I don't know if it'll get in focus or not. It's the one you had. I bought mine in 1975 when I was in high school.
Oh yeah,
Same
okay,
one that you
yeah,
showed,
yeah,
and
I
got me
got the
started
same one too.
yeah.
in actually my senior year at high school and down in the Edmonds Marsh and using this book doing my first ID. So
Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you,
well, you know,
Golden Boy.
I think my mother gave that to me so that I wouldn't take her Peterson's field guide out in the field anymore. You know, I still
Wonderful.
have mine. It's totally falling apart, but I'm not losing that. You know, I'll keep it till the end.
mine is too, and so I just keep it nicely on the shelf and only bring it out for special occasions.
Well, I
Exactly.
wouldn't be surprised if quite a few of our participants have that same book. I mean, it was great. It had the maps on one side and little
Yeah.
sonogram
No,
sort of things.
no, Chan
Well,
Robinson was very innovative in that and putting the
if you
maps on
colored the
there. Yeah.
edges with the colored
Yeah.
lines, you could immediately go from the index right to the page, and that was
Yeah.
good. It was
Yeah.
fun.
Yay. Thank you. Well, Tom is well known to the mountaineers. In fact, in 2020, he was given the annual service award for the whole organization. He's been just a powerhouse and so interested in passing on information, whether in person or on a field trip and so on. It's just so good to have you. And you're an excellent photographer too. All those photos I know were yours.
Many of them were. Yeah. No, I tried to acknowledge eBird where I stole them from eBird. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, that's the best
Great.
we can do for a standing ovation. I'll stand
Yeah.
up. Okay.
Sounds great. Thank you. That was
Thanks,
fun.
everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Now
everyone.
hopefully it gives you lots of good stuff to think about. I mean, I think to me, birds are so fascinating that every time I learn something new about birds, it makes 5 more questions to ask about them. So that's what's really fun.
You've
Yeah.
made it infectious. You've made it
Yeah.
infectious. Thanks
Yeah.
again, Tom.
All right. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.